Hello everybody. I thought let me give a crash history of the nation of Israel, the ancient history of Israel, not the modern history, the ancient history. Because I think it's important for us to understand that history for many reasons. It will also help us, I think, most importantly, it will help us to understand our Lord Jesus Christ better. And it will help us to understand most of the things that are in the New Testament. One thing that I have learned over the last few weeks is that, obviously with help from my pastor, Pastor Owen, is that when you study the Bible, you should study it with the lenses of Christ. You should study the Bible with Christ in mind, right from Genesis all the way to Revelations, through the lenses of Christ, because Christ is everywhere in the Bible. The whole book is about him. Now, when we study it like this. So we study what Jesus said, when we study what he did, and that is crucial. Now, if we want to understand why he said what he said and why he did what he did, we go to the Old Testament. The Old Testament gives us a basis, gives us a background of why he said some of the things that he said, in fact, all the things that he said. And then we also study the activities of the early church. Because the early church now, we are studying how the early church put into practice the words of Jesus, how they applied what he said. And that's very important for us in this era that we are living. And so I thought, let me give you just a brief history in summary of Israel, the ancient history of Israel. One thing that I found fascinating is that the history of Israel seems to be grouped in periods of 500 years, 500 years. If you look throughout the Old Testament, it's 500 years, 500 years, 500 years. These patches, perhaps 4 patches that I'm going to describe to you now. Well, before the first 500s I want to talk about, it was the time of the patriarchs. I'm talking from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. I don't want to talk about all that. You'll find that in the book of Genesis. But then they ended up being slaves in Egypt. Now, for a period of about 400 years, they were there as slaves in Egypt. And we know the story. They were led out of captivity, out of slavery by Moses, the prophet. And they moved through the wilderness, throughout that journey that you know, into the promised land. Of course, we know Moses didn't enter the promised land. He died behind the river Jordan as punishment by God because of something that he had done. So they cross over being helped or being led by Joshua. Joshua succeeded Moses and they got into the promised land. When they got in there, I'm skipping a lot of things here, but when they got in there, they settled according to their tribes. There were 12 tribes in total, coming from the 12 children of Jacob, who was later named Israel. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, up until we get to the last one, who was Benjamin. So they settled in the promised land according to their tribes, like that. It was God's design. And after Joshua died, they began to be led by judges. It was a period of the judges. And who are these judges? For 500 years, it was judge after judge after judge after judge. And there were about 12 of them. You know some of them. Samson. You remember Samson? Samson. Delilah. Samson. Yeah. Deborah, the lady. Samuel, the prophet. Samuel, the prophet, well, interestingly, he was the last judge to ever lead Israel. And after Samuel, obviously, the people cried for a king because they wanted to be like the other nations that surrounded them, that they had a king. They didn't have a king. God didn't want them to have a king. He wanted to be their king. But they said, no, you want a king when you go to war and all that. So the period of the judges ended on Samuel. So Samuel sort of is that crossover guy from the period of the judges into the next period that lasted again for 500 years. This was a period of the kings. At this point, they started to be led by kings because they cried for a king. And we know that the first king of Israel was Saul. Saul. After Saul, there was David. After David, there was Solomon. After Solomon, many other kings came. But I'm talking about a period of 500 years. And we know when you speak of the kings, Israel was at its most prosperous state when David was king. And David was from the tribe of Judah. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, the fourth child. Now, somewhere towards the end of those kings, maybe before I explain this, I want to get to this part. So we have Saul, who was replaced by David. David, who was replaced by his son, Solomon. When Saul, David, and Solomon were kings, Israel was one country, one state, one nation, made up of 12 tribes. But something happened just about when Solomon died. I don't want to go into the history of Solomon. You will find that in 1 Kings. Something happened there that when he died, the commander of the army of Solomon, whose name was Jeroboam, he led a rebellion. And that rebellion was aimed mainly at the house of Judah. The real reason was that when Solomon became king, there was this whole idea of building a temple and expanding Jerusalem and building Jerusalem, which was in the southern part of the state. So he introduced taxes to the people. And everyone was taxed. They were heavily taxed. And they hated the idea of tax. But Solomon wanted, the idea was he collects tax and then he uses the money to build the temple. And that's what happened. But then when all these taxes were collected, development only happened in the south, which is where Judah was, to build the temple there, to build Jerusalem there. In the northern parts, there was not much development. And there was this uprising. And then you see Jeroboam, who was the army commander of Solomon. When Solomon died, he led a rebellion based on this. Anyway, Israel got divided into two states, the northern side and the southern side. The northern kingdom had 10 tribes, so it was bigger, but much poorer. The southern side had 2 states or 2 tribes, which were Judah and Benjamin, and collectively they are known as Judah. Interesting, isn't it? So if you read, when you read in 2 Kings, especially 2 Kings, you will find the writer is writing. He writes and then he says, in Judah, this is what happened. In Israel, this is what happened. Because at that time, the northern 10 tribes are now what is referred to as Israel. The southern tribes are now what is referred to as Judah. So we have Israel and Judah, but actually, it's all Israel. But that's not what happened there. So now we have 2 states, 2 kingdoms in one country. Obviously, this was prophesied, and this was some kind of punishment from God, and so on. And when that happened, so king after king came. The kings in the north, they replaced each other. Another one died or they got killed and they were replaced with another one, but they remained like that. Those in the south, same thing. They lived, you know, and another king came. I'm talking about for a period of 500 years in total. But the kings in the north were bad. They were evil kings. The kings in the south were generally good kings. Now, here's, by the way, all this that I'm saying, it's in the Bible. It's in 1st and 2nd Kings. You read it for yourself. I'm just trying to help you to, when you read, it will be easier for you. Just somewhere towards the end of those 500 years, I'm talking about kings that had come and died, kings had come and died. I won't mention any names. I want to show you how that region looked like. Just that I don't have somewhere to write. But look, from Egypt, you cross the Red Sea. You get into that region, Israel. You look on the right side, you see the Mediterranean Sea. It's still there up to today. The Mediterranean Sea goes all the way to Europe. On the right hand, so you get Israel, it's right sandwiched in between there. On the right side, you see the Arabian desert. It's the wilderness. It's a desert. There's nothing there. Then you leave Israel, you go to the top. You see this vast piece of land, which is very fertile. It's this crest, which is so good and beautiful in terms of its outlook. It's green. It's just fertile. That land was called Mesopotamia. It wasn't really a country. Mesopotamia is almost like saying Sadek. It's a region with many cities in it. It's not a country. It wasn't a country. So there were many cities in there. So from there. Now, something happened during that time that in that Mesopotamian region, north after you cross Israel, there's a city there which was called Assyria. Assyria rose into prominence, into power, and dominated that whole region. It became a world power during that time, the way Egypt was. Now it's Assyria. And the Assyrian king, he had this quest to conquer and capture all these other states. And when he captures them, he would take them to Assyria. You know, it's like, I've never heard of such a thing. I mean, you colonize a country and then you take the people to your country. It's kind of strange, but that's what happened there. And he came to Israel, to the northern 10 tribes. He took the northern 10 tribes, those people, all of them, lifted them into Assyria. And there's no one in northern Israel. In the bottom, Judah remains. Remember, it's Judah and Benjamin. They are called Judah, all of them, both of them. So they've gone into captivity now. They've gone into exile. Every time you hear exile, this is the exile that's being spoken of, or captivity. They went to Assyria first, the 10 tribes. The northern 2 tribes remained. After a few years, Assyria got defeated in battle by another city again, which was, I would say, southeast in Mesopotamia. This city is called Babylon of King Nebuchadnezzar. Rose into power, defeated the Assyrians, while the 10 tribes of Israel are in captivity in Assyria. Assyria got defeated. Now there's a new superpower in town. And Babylon rose to prominence so much. I mean, they ruled that whole region, many parts of Europe. You come down to Africa, northern Africa, they were all ruled by Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar goes down to the remaining 2 tribes in Israel and takes them into captivity also. Now you have all of Israel in captivity. Remember, they didn't all start in Babylon. They were in Assyria first. Assyria got defeated by Babylon. Babylon is now the superpower. So it's just exchange of power while the Israelites are in captivity. Then they remain there. So they're in captivity. They stayed in captivity for a period of 70 years. Of course, it was because of a sin that they had committed, of a Sabbath year, that they missed the Sabbath year. Each seventh year, they were not supposed to farm. They were supposed to let the land lie idle. But they had missed that Sabbath year for 70 consecutive years. So the consecutive Sabbaths. Okay, so they had to go into captivity for 70 years so that the land could remain, unused and fallow for those years. So they remained there for 70 years. So Assyria is gone. Now there's Babylon, which has taken the southern two tribes, Judah. After a while, Babylon gets defeated again in battle by another superpower that arose during that time, that is called Persia. Persia defeated Babylon. Babylon is gone. The Israelites are still over there. They are no longer in their land. They are there in exile, in foreign land. And the first king of Persia, his name was Cyrus. Cyrus the Great. In case you Google him or you find him on the internet, or maybe you read him in history somewhere. Cyrus the Great was the first king of Babylon, of Persia. Let me just take you a little back. About 150 years before exile, while they were still in the promised land, there was a prophet there. His name was Isaiah. Isaiah had prophesied, I'm talking about 150 years prior to this, and he had said that later on there's going to be something that happens. You are going to be taken into captivity by another country, a foreign country, and you shall live there for a while. But there shall arise a king whose name is Cyrus, and Cyrus is the one who will give you your freedom back. 150 years before. But of course they didn't listen. They didn't like prophets very much. They killed prophets. And they stayed over there. Remember, like I'm saying, it's a summary. I'm skipping a lot of things there. Cyrus was replaced by two other very insignificant kings. So they are not recorded. So Cyrus, after Cyrus, then we say there is this other one called Darius. Darius got replaced by another king again called Xerxes. Xerxes is Xexes. Xerxes got replaced by another one called Artaxerxes, who was his son. You see, and the Israelites are over there. But Persia is the new boy in town now, ruling everybody. So when you read the book of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah says something like, I think he says, in the 3rd year of the rule of King Artaxerxes, I was mourning over my city, Jerusalem. And he's talking about that king who came after Xerxes, who was his father, Xerxes who came after Darius, Darius who came after Cyrus the Great. This is interesting. So they stayed there for over 70 years. The generation that left Israel and go to captivity, many of them died in exile. But the new generation was born. We know Daniel, for example, Daniel the prophet is one of the few people that left exile, went into exile, and wrote the book of Daniel while he's in exile. So he's one of those people that lived during those dispensations. Why is this important? By the way, when it was time for them to go back, when Cyrus gave that declaration to say, Israelites who are here in my land, you can go back to your country. And please, when you go there, pray also to your God. For me, he was very lenient actually with them. What surprises me is this. Out of all those millions that left the promised land, only 50,000 people went back to the promised land. They went back home. About 50, I know 50,000 at the beginning, then they were like 1,700 something in next, and a few people. I'm sure they were less than 60,000. But the bottom line is there were few people that went back. Because you see, Jews are very shrewd business people. When they settle in a land, they open businesses. They get successful. They got successful. And they didn't want to go back home. Why is this important and why is this relevant to us? You know, as I study the Bible, I figure out something, that God likes to speak in stories. He likes to give symbols. He doesn't speak like we do. He uses stories and symbols and, you know, parables. In every symbol, there's a story there. What I see there is that this is almost like a picture of our world today. We are here in this world, but this is not home. We are almost like pilgrimages. We are in a foreign land when we are here on earth. This is not our home. But surprisingly, when the call is given for people to give their lives to Christ, only a few people do so. Christ stands in the corridors and calls everybody to him, but only a handful of people go. Just like the Israelites, when the call was given to go back home, only 50,000 people out of all those millions went. Anyway, so when they got back to their promised land, we got into another period again of 500 years. At this time, they have gone back to their promised land, some of them, and they started multiplying again. And this was a period where judges are gone, kings are gone. Now it's a time where they were led by priests. And we know the first priest to lead Israel was Ezra. Ezra, who came from exile. And he led the Israelites. Then we had another 500. So these 500 years, the priests are living. There is no prophet in Israel for 500 years. Well, we know for sure that Persia eventually got defeated in battle by another power again that came after them called Greece. So we had the Grecian Empire that ruled. They stayed for a while. And after that, Greece fell. And we had another empire again that came, the Roman Empire. I know for a fact that the Roman Empire came somewhere around 700 BC, and they lasted for 700 years. So 700 BC, right about 400 AD, the Roman Empire is ruling. That whole 700 years. And in the middle of all of that 700 years, that's when Christ was born. And that empire was terrorizing everybody. They colonized, including Israel. You see, Israel was now colonized by the Romans. And Jesus was born during that time. No wonder why they killed him, because all this time, you see, they were looking for someone who would come and save them from the Romans. So they thought their Messiah was going to come and restore the nation of Israel, so to speak. You know, to restore the nation and give them political power. But he came with a totally different message. You know, he was talking of love and tolerance and loving your enemies and all that. And at the same time, he was claiming to be God, and they killed him because of that. In a nutshell, this is the history of ancient Israel. So when we see Christ now speaking certain things, we know it is with this background. When Christ came, there's no king in Israel. You will never hear of king in the New Testament. They are being ruled by priests who have now organized themselves into Pharisees, Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. And that's it. One most important thing that I don't want to forget also is that when they came back from exile, after the call was given by Cyrus the Great, they went back. They knew what sent them into exile it was punishment. Well, they didn't know that it was because of the 70 years, but they knew somewhere that it had also something to do with the way they lived. That God hated what they were doing. They were into idol worship, especially the northern 10 tribes. And God hated that. When they came back from exile, from that day up until today, 2020, Israel never went back into idol worship. They know it is the worst sin, worshiping other gods. Anyway, in a nutshell, this is the history, the ancient history of the nation of Israel. Thank you and God bless you.